what is important is to be able to step back and see things from a perspective. And if we can see things from a perspective of the Four Noble Truths, what happens is we turn up for the realities of a situation, recognize the dukkha, and understand it. This is, I think, the way we work through suffering. And this is a process of working through the Four Truths. So we step back, we understand suffering, we turn towards it, we accept it for what it is, we see deeply into it. And in that seeing deeply, we understand it. And in that understanding, we also start to see the second noble truth, the origins of suffering, whatever suffering we're having. With the second noble truth, when we start to realize the origins of suffering being craving, clinging, grasping, becoming, and so on, we then almost reflexly, almost automatically, like picking up a hot potato, you want to release it. Once you realize, oh, this is suffering, you want to let it go. So there's a release. There's a release of the origins of suffering. What happens then is the third noble truth, the freedom. At whatever level it is, whether it's complete awakening or just a relative awakening to some kind of pattern that you get caught up in, and we're releasing those patterns and finding a relative freedom. To the extent you can let go, you experience the third noble truth, being the reality of freedom. And in some cases, it can be noble freedom, noble awakening, such as the experience of nirvana, for example, or it can be a kind of ennobling freedom, a relative freedom, like myself, when I was realizing how much I was caught up in this ideal of attaining the jhanas, and then releasing that grasping and clinging and finding some relative peace. When we experience the third truth, the task of that truth is to realize it, to recognize it, to acknowledge it. And then when we do that, we realize the fourth truth as well, which is there is a path. There's a path we live. There's a path of practice. This path of practice not only leads to awakening, but it is the path of awakening, which is the Eightfold Path, being ethics, the cultivation of the mind, heart, mind, and wisdom. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, of course. This is the way we live. So I was starting to come on to the second story now. The first story is of relative suffering. Sorry, not relative suffering. The dukkha at its kind of light level, along the light level of the spectrum of dukkha. So 1 year ago, I just walked, we had on the 28th of February, we had devastating floods. And I walked 100 meters down my road. I live on a hill. I live on the hill in Lismore, Gerard's Hill. And it's high out of the floods. But I walked just 100 meters down the road. And I witnessed houses and businesses submerged, and kayaks and canoes bring people to dry land. These, the survivors of the flood were waterlogged, carrying only their pets. Some people were coming with cats and dogs. Other people completely drenched. There was one friend of my partner's down the road, and she had to leave her dog and a cat in her home, and she was completely worried about them. She was just drenched. So, I mean, a light side of that story is that that cat and that dog were saved a day later. somebody in a canoe went by her house and got them out. They were barking and making a noise, so they saved them. So when I went down the road, my heart just burst into tears. Actually, it was just devastating, and there was a mix of deep sadness as well as compassion and an irresistible urge to help. And in the weeks and months that followed, often I'd be riding to work or going downtown, and I'd often just burst into tears because you'd see, old churches that were being used for like 100 years at least, just kind of barred up, and buildings and clubs. I mean, the Workers' Club, I don't even know if the Workers' Club's open anymore. This club that's been there for, I don't know how many years, 50 years or something, just barred up. And sometimes some of the shops have been repaired. A lot of them are vacant. There's some things happening. And I went driving over, as I mentioned earlier, I went driving over South Lismore, which was got the worst of the flood. Houses completely submerged, some of them, people being airlifted off roofs, and actually they weren't airlifted off roofs. They were, canoes were going to their homes, and boats and tinnies, and all the people of Lismore and surrounds would came with their little whatever they had. Sometimes people with kayaks, paddle boards, helping people. And there's countless stories of some people being trapped in their roofs. And I heard a story of someone taking a meat cleaver to a roof. They could hear where they were because they could hear them banging against the roof, the people inside the house. And the person in the tinny went back to his house and got a meat cleaver, I think, and just banged his way through the roof so he'd get these people out of being trapped in the roofs. So, weeks and months later, I still burst into tears every now and then. And I mean, there's hundreds of people still very traumatized by the memories and the threat to life. And grief-stricken, a lot of people lost everything completely. And many of them didn't have insurance. They lost their homes. People died. There were people dying, not only in Lismore, but in surrounding areas. There was loss of life. Everyone lost, and a lot of people lost their possessions. And what was buoying about this was that people were coming together and offering incredible generosity and kindness. So I was driving through Lismore last week, through South Lismore last week, and I saw a little sign said, 50 kilometres, please. People still live here. And yes, there are some people still living there. They're camping in their homes and so on. And there are some signs of life, but mostly it's empty. Mostly, there's a Northern Rivers pub, I think, is still barred up. The houses some of them have been condemned, so you can't even stay in them. So, there's shopping complexes. There's one shopping complex downtown that had a Domino's and had other things. It's completely vacant. So how do we cope with this? I mean, how do we cope with the last year? Has been last year, including recent events, has been horrendous. The Ukraine war, earthquakes in Syria and Turkey, cyclones in New Zealand, and floods in our own, not only Lismore, but most of the whole of the eastern states have been flooded. There's been loss of life. I think, how do we cope? Well, I often think of the ways I work with grief. Like a lot of people are feeling grief still. I am still grieving, but it's nothing compared to what some people are experiencing. And I've seen a lot of people in my professional career working with grief, like the loss of someone who they loved. And I have a bit of a story, I have a bit of a spiel about how we overcome grief. And it's based on, there's many models of overcoming grief. And one model is like the task model. And it describes overcoming grief with 4 tasks. And the first task is to recognize grief, of course, is the emotion of loss, is what happens to us when we lose something that is dear to us. And I've lost a lot just in the city, but some people have lost so much in our Lismore, in our town, in our surrounding areas. And across the world, people are losing so much. So the way I've helped people work with grief is by firstly helping them understand these 4 stages. The first in these stages is to accept the reality of the loss. A lot of us want to deny it. We can't really kind of connect with that. It's difficult. I know that when my mother died about 12 years ago. My sister died last year, the year before last. And there's a time where it feels sort of surreal. You can't really accept the reality of the loss. And you see people wandering around town after the flood. It's surreal. They're just kind of not connecting. My home's gone. I have no more home. There is this slow process of opening up and turning to the reality of this suffering and accepting the reality of it. With that, the next step is to experience the pain of the loss. And a lot of people, they've experienced a lot of pain. When people are grieving, sometimes there's a denial or a dissociation, I think, because they just need to cope with that. That's understandable. Sometimes it's just too much to bear to face up to the realities of something, the dukkha of that. But eventually, when we do face up to it, we accept the reality of something. Then we allow ourselves to feel the pain. And it's painful. It hurts. Yet to avoid it is to deny it is to avoid it, and we don't really kind of work through it. If we can accept the reality of the pain, then we're able to kind of come to what's called the 3rd stage, which is some sort of closure, I suppose, one way of talking about it. But, another way of talking about it is a kind of a philosophical resolution to it, a deep acceptance of it, a coming to terms with it, a coming to terms with the reality of it. And this is kind of liberating. It's not getting rid of the pain, so to speak, but it's certainly alleviating it. Sometimes when I talk to people about grief, and this is the same in this case, I show them my arm, and you might not be able to see that. No, you probably can't see it. I've got a scar that goes along my arm there. It's about, I don't know, probably about 6 or 7 inches. I got this scar when I had a motorcycle accident when I was about 25. So that's a long time ago. And in that motorcycle accident, I ended up in hospital and unconscious, and I came out of it with my arm. In the process, my arm snapped in half. I think it's the radial, snapped in half, and they put a pin in it, so they put it together. And at first I couldn't. When I came out of hospital, I couldn't use my arm very well, and it was quite painful, especially to touch. But slowly and gradually, I began to use it, and slowly and gradually, it became like it wasn't as painful, and I just got on with life. And these days, like 42 years later, it's still painful sometimes, especially when I press it. When I press into it, it hurts. And there's a scar there. I know it's there. It's scarred there. It's obvious. So sometimes when I speak to people about grief, I compare it to my scar, and it's just like a scar of one's heart. If they lose someone that's dear to them, or something that's dear to them, the scar almost represents a way of honoring that being's life, or that thing's existence, and treasuring it. And if we press into it, like once we go into it, it still hurts. It's like the scar is always going to be there in your heart. And but we get on. We get used to we get familiar with the scar. We get to know it. We know that it's painful, and we accept the reality of it, and we move on. So the fourth stage is getting on in life without investing all one's mental energies into that situation, that occurrence, that loss. So in the world of impermanence and uncertainty, grief is a completely natural response to the vicissitudes of life. And we naturally attach to our loved ones and ourselves. We naturally attach to our homes, for example, because we need that. And to attach to our loved ones is a necessity for us to be human. It is the way it is. And we attach to our children, for example. And in fact, it's an imperative for us to attach to our children and them to know that we're attached to them, in order for them to know that they're cared for and they're loved and they're treasured and they're supported through their developmental phases. It's important for them, for their development. So when we have grief, when we lose things, it's natural. It's a natural thing. And it's almost like something we accept, because to be otherwise, we would not want to be otherwise. It's the pain we accept for the reality of our wholesome attachments in this case. So how do we get over the horrendous stuff that's happening in the world and the grief of Lismore? And I come back to that. The 5 faculties again, or the 5 powers. I think that it is possible to overcome suffering. When people can have some faith and confidence that it is possible to overcome the pain of their grief, for example, then it gives them energy to move on. It gives them energy to move forward. It gives them, when we have trust and confidence in psychological freedom, it helps us move beyond the despair of grief. And it gives us power to resolve, to act in ways that are helpful to nourish patterns of, to de-nourish patterns of craving and grasping and clinging, and nourish patterns that lead to freedom. When mindfulness is established, being present with the experience here now, our mental energies unify and our minds still. And the focus to maintain unified attention is purifying. It helps us let go. It breaks down and deconditions our habitual patterns of seduction by the pleasant and aversion and rejection of the unpleasant. It helps us grow wisdom. And here, wisdom in terms of the grief of Lismore, for example, and the realities of, say, climate change and so on, we need to accept the reality of what's happening. And here, it doesn't mean we become inactive. It doesn't mean we don't act. Often there's a confusion about equanimity or deep acceptance as being passive, as being kind of rolling over and saying, oh yeah, I surrender. But it's not that. It's about being willing to accept the reality of the situation and being willing and knowing how to act in ways that are helpful and not act in ways that are unhelpful, and find freedom in that deep acceptance, I suppose. So I just got this last paragraph. I'll just read it. When we witness the loss of life and property, the devastation of disasters, and the madness of war, it is very easy to feel overwhelmed with the despair, sadness, and grief. At the same time, if we can deeply accept the reality of the situation, this reality is the reality of this moment, and we can continue to do what we can, protest about war, protest about climate change in action, act compassionately with natural disasters where and when it's needed. We can find some meaning there. And if we can come from a place of deep peacefulness, of being courageously present, if we can come from a place of deep acceptance, which is also compassionate, we can be free psychologically. So thank you for your attention, and may we all overcome dukkha in whatever way we experience it, whether it be at the light or the severe end of the spectrum, and realize the deep peace of nibbana. Thank you.